Do you ever feel like it should be easier to find exciting landscape compositions, and that there must be something more creative than the rule of thirds and other similar guides which can actually harm your photography with stiff and predictable results? The good news is that there's a simple technique that I've been teaching my students for years to help them craft unique and creative compositions effortlessly, and in this video I'll show you what this game-changing trick is and the simple steps you can follow to create amazing landscape compositions every time. Now let me show you how it works. First, you might be wondering, what's wrong with the rule of thirds anyway, or the golden ratio, or the golden spiral, or the golden triangle, or there's a lot of golden going on. Yeah, the diagonal triangles and all of these other guides. Aside from the fact that that's just way too many things to remember and think about when you're in the moment, trying to capture a great photo before that perfect light disappears in the blink of an eye. The thing about all these guidelines is that that's all they are. Guidelines. They're not rules at all. In fact, Adobe's website that explains the rule of thirds, the very first thing it says is not really a rule. Now, all these rules and guides are really just simply placeholders or templates that can help you find a composition with the right underlying goal of giving your photos one thing. Now, the problem is that they can cause many photographers to believe that if your scene doesn't fit one of these rules, then the composition's no good. And that's far from the case. So what is that one thing that these guides are designed to give your compositions? I'll tell you what it is. It's balance. But the thing is, there are other ways to create perfectly balanced compositions without resorting to these templates. To show you how it works under the hood, first let me draw some circles on this blank page in Photoshop. And then in a second I'll show you how to use it on real images and scenes. But first, just tell me, do these points that I've drawn feel evenly distributed across the frame? Not really, right? So how about now? Hopefully you said, yes, they do feel a bit more balanced. So when we look at it, what's the difference? What is the actual real difference? Why does this one feel more balanced than this one? Well, in the first example, both points were over on the left-hand side of the frame, leaving a big empty gap on the other side. And so intuitively, it just feels uneven. But in this second example, they're evenly balanced, left to right, top to bottom. And in this specific example, one is counterbalancing the other, bottom left versus top right. Now, you didn't need a guide or a special overlay to tell you this. You could just sense the balance when you isolated these 2 points in the image and judged their position within the frame. Now, when there's only 2 points like this, it doesn't really matter exactly where they are in the frame, as long as one counterbalances the other. So if the bottom one is so far from the bottom of the frame, then the top one should be roughly that same distance from the top, for example. And this means that they might end up on the thirds lines or on a thirds intersection, but the important difference is they don't have to. If you were sticking to the rule of thirds, then you'd try placing them exactly on these intersections at the expense of any other more creative alternatives. So this 2 point of interest example is a great one to get started using this idea because it covers you for shots where you've got something in the foreground and something in the background. And this kind of composition probably makes up a large part of your image catalogue. But the difference is now you're not restricted to just placing those objects on the thirds intersections or lines. You can be more free with the positioning when you know how to maintain the balance between them. So how do you actually apply this to real photos? Let me show you some real world examples, which I've already captured to see how this works in real life. The first step in any scene is to identify the key points of interest. So first question, what is a point of interest? Well, for me, it's essentially the things that visually stand out in your frame. Things like distinctive shapes, textures, and objects. These are the things that are unique or special about the scene that you're photographing at the time. Or to put it even more broadly, because it's an infinite list otherwise, the things in your photograph. As well as interesting things, we're automatically drawn to areas of high contrast, so dark objects on a light background and vice versa. The sun is a common example, but also the dark ridgeline against the bright sky. And this shot is a point of interest too because of its contrast. An interesting spot of light shining onto something that can create a point of interest virtually out of nothing, or it can accentuate a shape or object that's already there. Objects with contrasting colours can also draw the eye and make something become a point of interest. In this example, the red bin lid sticks out like a sore thumb, which makes it a point of interest, whether I like it or not. In this case, I had a choice to make, and I chose to leave it in the frame, in the composition, but edit it out later in Photoshop. So implied points of interest is an interesting one. This is the point where converging lines or leading lines are directing the view to whether or not there's actually a physical object at the end of those lines. You're still being drawn to that point. And things with a lot of visual weight. So this one's a little more tricky to explain quickly. But one example is how a large area of dark negative space holds a lot of weight in the scene. So this example feels unbalanced with this massive area of high visual weight over on this one side, but counterbalance it with a small but high contrast point of interest over here, and the scene feels more balanced. So in the real world, a large mountain that takes up a big part of a scene is also actually holding a lot of visual weight, even though there might not be a small specific point on it that we're drawn to. The whole thing needs balancing out with something else in the scene. Now, if you're struggling to define 2 or 3 main points of interest in a scene or a photo that you've already captured, then it's probably for one of these 2 reasons. One is that there's too many. So if there are too many points of interest that kind of draw your attention, then maybe the scene is a bit too busy and you should recompose to isolate 2 or 3 main elements to focus on. Alternatively, consider what you might be able to edit out to make these busy elements less of an impact. Now, the second reason is that there's not enough. So this is something I used to get wrong all the time when composing a scene with a large foreground. I'd place the horizon up on the top thirds line, and without a real point of focus in the foreground, that means the bottom 2/3 of this scene would often be very boring and not really give us any reason to look at it. Now, a large foreground can work without a single point of interest in it. For example, in this one, where I wanted to capture the waves rushing towards me as they create this texture over the rock shelf. But that's what gives this image still an interesting foreground. The detail and the texture of the entire area is something that you're drawn to. So once you've identified your key points of interest in a scene, let me show you how to know if they're balanced or not. So this is a great exercise to do on some of your older photos, because you'll get a lot of practice seeing a scene in this way before you try to head out with your camera and use this technique for real. And you'll probably find some diamonds in the rough in those old photos too, when you use what I'm showing you here to crop some of your older shots for a better composition. And who knows how many old photos you might be able to bring to life with this. Let me circle the key points of interest in this photo. And there we go. Most of the time, just doing this part will be enough to gauge the balance and distribution of these points across the frame, just like we did when there was no image on the screen. So we can judge, are they too close together? Are they too close to the edges of the frame? Are they overlapping with each other? Are they over to one side of the frame too much? Now, if it's not immediately clear whether these points of interest are balanced, then here's another trick that you can use that makes it even easier to visualize the balance. Simply draw lines between the points of interest, kind of like a dot to dot, and it'll create a shape. And this way it becomes that much easier to judge the spread of the object and whether it feels balanced or not. Now, balancing points of interest is just one part of what makes a great composition, but it won't really count for anything unless you ask yourself 3 critical questions before you capture every photo. To discover what these 3 questions are, watch this video next.